Archival note. This leather-bound book was recovered from a cedar trunk among the belongings of Elmer Reid after his death in late 1982. The entries that follow are presented here exactly as written, with only minimal punctuation corrections for legibility. Names in the original are sometimes spelled differently. My editors and I have standardized the creatures' names to Kurra, occasionally spelled Kurra or Kar in the original, and Thre, occasionally Thre or Thre. Judge the rest for yourselves. June 4th, 1977. Tracks. We'd been driving gravel back roads until the Bronco's shocks complained. Vince and I had the windows down even though the weather had a damp chill. His camera bag rattled in the passenger footwell, a Pentax for wide shots, an old Nikon with a 50mm that he swore by. The radio kept a country station on the AM because everything else was static way up in the mountains. Thomas Reid's journals lived in the glove box like a talisman. His handwriting was smudged in spots where he'd dried wet ink with a thumb and kept going. Grandpa had drawn footprints in a way that bothered me for a long time. Always too large for any man, but exact enough that you wondered if he'd seen them. We found the print in a muddy turnoff where the road narrowed to nothing. The mud had pulled away in a perfect crescent, the skin of it showing ridges like fingerprints. I squatted down and measured from heel to the longest toe with the brass tape Vince carries, 17 inches. I don't know why I wrote the number in the margin of my own notebook. Old habits, measure, sketch, mark the date. Vince knelt, cameras forgotten. Those are fresh, he said. His voice had a flatness to it that told me he'd been a soldier longer than he'd been a photographer. Ex-Vietnam. He'd seen things that made most men stop counting the cost. He counted anyway. We followed a half-hour notch of prints that led off the road and into the trees like someone had been walking on all fours, and then decided to stand up and keep going. The prints didn't spread. They didn't run. They were patient. June 6, 1977. Packing and the old journals. I slept poorly on the shoulder of the road with the Bronco lights making a stain in the dark. In the morning, I reread Grandpa's notes by flashlight. Thomas Reid had mentioned an untended valley, and a naturalist's account from 1889 he'd lifted from a used bookstore in Tacoma. He'd copied passages about tall primates rumored in the high valleys and drawn a map with a cross. There are men who read old accounts like maps of treasure. I read them like an instruction manual for keeping secrets. Vince and I packed tight, 2 sleeping bags, a canvas tent, freeze-dried rations, rope, a shotgun strapped to the roof. We needed it for bear, I told myself. And 3 rolls of Tri-X the way Vince liked it, underexpose and you'll pull something honest in the darkroom. We carried a pocket knife Grandpa had given me, the one he used to carve initials in tree bark. I thought about taking the strap of the Bronco camera off and sewing it into my jacket, as if any of that would matter. We moved slow. We followed the prints and the contour lines of the land. The valley hollered its presence before we saw it. A hollow sound where the world curled in on itself and held secrets like a fist. June 10th, 1977. Ridge observation. We got to a ridgeline in the late light and sat on a slab of granite cold enough to take the warmth off your hands. From there, the valley looked ridiculous, a bowl of pines and gray rock, a braid of river catching sun. Against a vertical face of stone, something like woven tent sat tucked into shadows. Black-green material picked to match lichen. They had the look of shelter built by people who'd studied the rock and the winds and then tried to argue with them. We debated. Vince kept pointing out tactical risks as if we were still on patrol. "We stay up here, log it, come back with more supplies," he said. I wanted to slide down into that hollow and ask whatever lived there if they'd pass the time. The argument was old between us, my reckless curiosity, his careful calculation. He eats the map. I read the map like a prayer. At dusk, when the valley shaded itself, we climbed down. The trail narrowed into game paths, and then into no path at all. Sound died around us like an audience going quiet. Once, something moved in a tree, and our heads locked together, and we both held our breath at the same time, like old men who'd rehearsed scared. June 11th, 1977. First contact. The clearing was sunlit and smelled of smoke and drying meat. The shelters were closer now, woven from saplings and what seemed to be strips of hide or bark. They were clever in a way a trapper would admire, Overlapping layers, drainage holes, vents in precise places. There were footprints pressed into the ground around them, enormous and shaped in rough alignment with the ones we had been following. We stopped. Vince thumbed the film advance on his camera and it clicked the way old soldiers make little sounds to prove their hands are still steady. I haven't always been a man who knows what to do, only that I can't unsee what's in front of me. They saw us before we did. Kurra came out from behind a rock like the land itself was unfurling a face. He was taller than the pines in the clearing looked from where I stood. I say that because it's how the room felt when he filled it. Hair the color of old river reeds hung from his jaw. His shoulders carried scars that looked like the memory of rope. He didn't roar. He moved with the caution of a man walking on glass. Behind him, thinner and more nervous, came Thre. Where Kurra's face folded in solemnity, Thre's was open like a sketchbook. Thre watched with the directness of someone painting the world for the first time in a while. We should have backed away. We should have, by rule and by sense, made ourselves small and silent and retreated. Instead, Vince and I did what our bodies knew to do if they were going to meet a living thing. We set our packs down and took our guns off. Bad idea, or the only decent idea. There was a long, wordless exchange where two species sized one another up and then chose to say nothing. Kurra's hands were big and calloused, like a farmer's hands, but gentle. He stepped forward and extended his arm palm up. Not in a threatening way, but in a way that said, "Look, I can show you my hands." I put my palms up in answer because every guidebook my grandfather ever wrote had a page about trust trees. Show your palms so there's nothing hidden. Thre came close enough that I could see a lattice of mud under his fingernails, the kind you get when you craft in clay. He cupped his own face with his fingers like a child who has learned to mimic the gesture of wiping sleep from the eyes. Then he did something I won't forget. He reached up, slow, like a man offering mercy, and touched my cheek. The hair on his wrist scratched the dust on my skin. His fingers were cool and had the smell of pine resin and iron. For a second, the world shifted enough for the sky to look like someone else's roof. The thing that crossed me then wasn't fear. It was a kind of recognition as old and as dangerous as memory. Kurra offered a small object wrapped in cloth. Vince caught it in a photograph before I could stop him. It was a knife, a crude metal blade hammered into shape. The hilt was bound with sinew. I would later learn the metal was old, tempered in a way that made you think of ship rails or the buckles on antique saddlework. Kurra didn't try to sell me anything. He simply opened his hand and let the thing sit there like a question. June 12, 1977. Inside the shelter. They let us in as if leading strangers into church. Inside the shelter, the air was warm and smelled of oil, smoked meat, and the faint sweetness of paper. There were shelves of things, pots, stones shaped like hammers, antler prongs stacked with the order of a man's tool chest. There was a place where bones were tied and dried, and another where hides were stretched. In a corner lay a neat stack of newspapers, pages yellowed and folded like prayers. I remember seeing a headline from 1951 folded into itself, "Missing Man, Last Seen Near Pass." Someone had kept these from long ago and new again. They had made a bed of woven grasses and laid something like a small altar with drawings and charcoal. Thre's hands worked like fingers that couldn't stop sketching. He had made a long, thin scroll of paper from bark, and on it were pictures of mountains and shapes of things flying above them. The pictures were naive and awful. You could see the strokes where fear had been carved into lines. In the margins were dates, years, and names. Not ours, but other words I didn't know how to read yet. We traded. They offered meat, dried thin strips that tasted of smoke and juniper. Vince offered coffee in exchange, and later would say he couldn't taste it because he was shaking too much. I gave them the sewn strap of my camera. Thre gently wrapped it around his wrist the way a man would a bracelet. He made a small knot and tied a feather into it. I realized then that they kept memory like men keep photos, carefully, intimately, as if it were law. June 14th, 1977. Words and songs. Over the next days we ate, slept, and listened. Language between us would not come with a single click. It came by imitation. A hand goes up, and fingers splay like the sun, and we say, light, and point at the window slits, and they repeat the gesture. Thre loved shapes. He responded by drawing. Kurra loved ritual. He responded by arranging things, and then sitting very still while we learned their arrangement. There was music too, an undercurrent of humming that seemed to do the work speech hadn't yet earned. When they vocalized, it came out as low notes from Kurra, and a thin flute-like series from Thre. They sang sometimes, and I found myself listening like a kid eavesdropping on prayer. They knew the names of animals and places. They had names for rocks and river bends and methods for catching trout that turned on patience and the right kind of silence. Vince learned to watch the water and set a line without the bait moving in his hands. I learned to knot a rope to make a shelter if the wind would not be kind. I have tried to write down how their gestures became grammar, but it's dishonest to pretend we were fluent. We were apprentices, fumbling and honest. We learned they feared a noise they called by pointing to the sky and miming the spin of blades, and their charcoal drawings showed cages and men carrying things. They drew faces of men with devices, and men with nets. And once, a crude metal cage, with bars, and a word that looked like it might mean trap in their shorthand. These pictures had been layered for years. The walls of one cave were like a diary of small violences. June 20th, 1977, photography. Vince took photographs. I don't mean that in the way people say they took snapshots. He made images the way he had in the war, with patience and with the terrible respect of a man who had seen how pictures could be used, for better and for worse. He shot film, and then he stacked the exposures, making sure to keep negatives in a dry tin wrapped in oiled cloth. They watched the camera with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Kurra would sometimes hum low and hold out a hand to touch the metal, as if to feel the sound it must make inside. I wrote so much my wrist cramped. I wrote about the way light broke over Thre's jawline, caught in hair, how the animals in their stew came from seasons I was only beginning to read. I sketched. I tried to be faithful to details that would matter later. The way their shelters sloped to the east for drainage, the exact taper of a spear carved from antler, the smell of resin on a bundle of tinder. It felt like building an ark out of words. June 28th, 1977. The cave wall. We followed a path in the dark that led to a grotto where the wall was covered in work. Charcoal, berry dyes, and pressed pigments bound with some oil. There were long bands of drawing that looked older than the youngest among them. They told a story that wasn't linear so much as layered, a palimpsest of memory. I could read the topmost layer. Men in helmets dropping from the sky, ropes, cages. Deeper underneath there were figures with long arms carrying boats, and others that looked like they were being tended. The oldest lines were faint and showed people in tall shapes sitting by fire, as if council had been taking place since before calendars mattered to them. Thre pressed his hand to the stone, and then to my chest, and then to the drawing. His thumb traced the line of a cage, and then the arc of the sky. I understood that this place had been keeping a record of the hurt done to them for a long time. July 2nd, 1977. First rotor. We heard it at dawn. At first I thought a log truck because the sound was from the valley floor and came up like a grumble. Then the air moved with that rightness of metal, a frequency that makes birds go silent and dogs thrash. Kurra stopped. Thre's hand went to his ear the way a child might. They had a look I have seen in old dogs when a gunshot passes them, memory of a past injury. We watched the sky. An unmarked chopper passed low, too low to be just surveying. It had no markings, no flag. Men in the clearing held their breath like a community that had learned to hold the world still when it frightened them. The chopper didn't hover to take pictures or to shout. It flew a sweep like it was searching. When it passed again an hour later, the valley sent up smoke to make itself small or invisible. Kurra moved with a deliberate calm and tied extra hides across the openings of shelters. Thre drew more pictures. It occurred to me then that if such a machine paid attention to this valley, men with motives would come in suits of different colors. Hunters who imagined trophies, scientists who imagined sample boxes, private men who simply thought of value. I felt a cold pressure in my chest that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The creatures in the clearing felt it too, and they deferred to it the way a family defers to a bad weather. July 3rd, 1977. A choice. The question sat in the shelter like a second person. We could go down the pass and tell someone, a ranger, a university, a man we trusted. We could write a letter and send the negatives to a newspaper or take them to the Smithsonian bandstand and watch a world of men in suits decide what the valley's fate would be. Or we could stay. The idea of staying was built out of something older than stubbornness. It was a refusal to be the instrument of a kind of violence I had seen before. Expose them, and they'll be boxed and stuffed and put under glass, Vince said. He wasn't an idealist when he said it. He was a man trying to be practical and moral at the same time. Hide them, and we become their keepers. We become liars. I thought of Grandpa's map folded and frayed. I thought of the way men had always been ready to turn wonders into trophies. I thought of Thre's charcoal lines of cages. I thought of the look on Kurra's face when the chopper passed, and the way his shoulders took the weight of what's been lost. We did not decide that day. Instead, we camped outside the shelters and took turns listening. At night, under a sky that had nothing to do with the valley's dangers, Kurra hummed and Thre sang like someone teaching the world how to be held. I wrote until my hand cramped and then sat and watched the way the fire made Thre's hair a halo. If I am honest, the decision had already been made in the moving of my hands, to keep this secret, to watch and to record in the quiet way of a witness. The question was whether I could live with the consequences. If this found journal is gripping you, and you'd like to follow every entry and every photograph as they appear, subscribe and stay with this account. There are more pages to read if you want the full chronology. July 8th, 1977. A gift of metal. Kurra brought out the metal knife again, the one I had seen on our first day. He placed it on his knee and tapped the blade as if to make it speak. Vince took a sequence of pictures. Kurra then unwrapped a small bundle and revealed a strip of paper, edges frayed, the ink gone brown with time. It was a clipping from a paper dated 1912 describing a giant of the pass, and a note in the margin in a handwriting that looped like a river. On the same page, someone had pasted a fragment of cloth, a swatch of wool with a button sewn into it. Thre showed us a book one evening, not a modern thing but an old naturalist's guide whose pages smelled like old rain. In the margins, Thre had drawn tiny maps, and then more troubling small X's where men in hats and men with machines had visited. The book had a map that, when you lift the page, reveals another fold and then another. In one of those folds we found a mark, not on parchment this time but on skin. A map had been transferred into their story the way prophecies are sometimes told. Quietly, between the lines. There are people who will read this and want hard answers. I will give no more than I possess. We were given artifacts. They were kept like talismans. They were offered without strings. I felt guilty for wanting to know and afraid for wanting to show. July 14th, 1977. The night they spared us. A ground party came down the valley one night. Not a chopper this time, but men on foot moving with flashlights like beetles. They carried guns and an equipment case that clinked. I saw them first out in the river wash. It was wrong and right that my heart slammed. Kurra had a look like a wolf that hears a pack and decides whether to flee. Thre trembled but did not run. He wrapped a cloth around a drawing and pressed it to his chest. The men stopped at the edge of the clearing, looked and then sat down as if they'd been told to wait. I watched them through a slit in the shelter. They spoke low into a radio with voices that said, "Hold position. Wait for the chopper to confirm." They had not seen us, I think. They were looking for the easy prize. There are things I refuse to write. Not because they are false, but because they will make the men who read this want to change the world in ways that will only harm. I will say this. Night has a way of making people generous in the wrong direction. Kurra and Thre did not panic. They made no noise. They arranged hides to make the shelter look empty. They offered their hands to the earth and not to the sky. When the men with the flashlights passed by with their light sweeping the clearing, Thre began to sing a small, low song, and it worked on my nerves like a balm. The men moved on. July 15th, 1977. Aftermath and a new resolve. We sat by the river after the men left, and the valley breathed as if it had been holding its breath for years. Kurra said something with a soft sadness, pointing at the sky, and then at the chest where he'd placed the knife. I put my palm to my chest and tried to say, "We will help." The words felt small. Vince had his camera on his lap and was looking at the photographs he'd taken. He had a look like a man whose faith had been rearranged. "We can't be neutral," he said. "Either we tell, or we don't." "What if telling means they come with cages?" I said. There was no comfort in the idea that secrets kept safe could be the same as cowardice. We agreed to stay one more week, then another. I told myself we would be careful. I lied to myself with all the honesty I could muster. We would be the keepers of a secret, and we would not betray the people who had been brave enough to lay a knife on our palm. August 3rd, 1977. On becoming quiet. Days pass by different measures when you live in someone's trust. There are calendars you keep with the mapping of seeds and hunts, and there are calendars you keep with names. I marked months by the frequency of the birds that nested on the ridge, and by the exact time the sun would brighten the corner of the shelter where Thre painted. I stopped thinking of home as a place with a roof and started thinking of it as a set of obligations. I learned when to light the bellows and when to hold the line while Kurra shaped antler into a blade that would not rust. I learned, quietly, how to be less useful to strangers and more useful to the small family that had chosen us. Sometimes, at night, I would take Grandpa's notebook and trace the maps with my thumb. I would try to stare straight into the drawn cross that marked the pass and see if there were any other marks that might be doors. Once, in the margins of the old naturalist's book, Thre had copied a smear of ink that looked like a star. On the back of that page had been a scribbled line that might have been coordinates if I had maps of the kind men use now. Instead, it looked like a promise. August 16th, 1977. The map. It was Thre who found the folded scrap. He was humming as he always did, and he found it under a can that Vince had used for boiling coffee. The paper was brittle and smelled of moss. There was a line, and then another, and in the corner someone had made a small cross and written a year. 1889. Underneath were marks like those on Grandpa's map. For a moment I felt like a man who'd stumbled on an old inheritance. The mark suggested other places, other valleys, other families. We laid the map between us like a treaty. Kurra tapped his finger along a fold and then pointed at a distant point on the paper that might have been the sea. The realization that we were not the last of whatever this was came in soft, terrible waves. But with that realization came another, a plan. If there were others, then there were routes and safe houses and perhaps people who had decided, in other places and by other names, to keep quiet. If any of that was true, then it mattered who knew and how they knew it. If we were to look for them, it would mean leaving the relative safety of the valley to walk into valleys that might be less kind. It would mean being deliberate about what we left behind. August 22nd, 1977. Decision. We decided finally that Vince and I would not be the men to drag this into headlines. We decided to be less than what the world would ask of us, and more than what fear demanded. We would stay, learn, make an archive, and, if possible, search for others. We would hide the negatives in tin and hide the tins in places men do not usually look. We would teach Thre and Kurra the use of the camera in the way we taught them the knot. They would teach us songs. That night we built a cache under a root mound, and I buried Grandpa's original map with a new cover note written in my own hand. For those who find it after me, read with caution. This was the first outward-facing thing I did that felt like an oath. September 7th, 1977, a narrow call. A chopper came back. This time it hovered and sent a line down toward the clearing. Men in high boots stepped out with a presence that smelled of machinery and paperwork. They took pictures with larger machines than Vince's, and they had clipboards. I watched from the long grass and the hair on my arms prickled. Kurra moved like a man who knows the whole history of being hunted and is tired. They scanned the valley for signs and then, as if having their plans interrupted, they left. I do not know why they left, only that they did. But their visit carved a new kind of fear into us all. Not immediate, but inevitable as rain in the shoulder seasons. The journal ends tonight for now. The valley has changed since we came down the ridge that first day. The lives of everyone in that clearing, Kurra, Thre, Vince, and me, are knotted together the way rope holds a boat to a dock. There are choices that must be made soon, whether to spread the word quietly, whether to move on a map's hint, whether to trade a life of secrecy for the promise of numbers. I write this by firelight and have the sensation of being at an intersection, where one foot stays on the path and another steps off into a country of unknown books and old maps. The next pages are inked into the future, but the present is the sound of a rotor on the horizon and the small, steady hum of two people who have trusted us enough to let us look at their knives. August 30th, 1977. Small mercies. Summer thinned out like an old shirt. The days kept warmth as if it were a coin they dared not spend, but the nights came with a hard edge. We learned in those first months that living with someone is more work than learning their language. It is learning when to leave them alone and when to step forward and carry a burden they cannot set down. We made habits. Mornings were for mending and for the small private ordinariness that keeps a fragile world intact. I would throw a wire across the fire and heat water for coffee while Vince tuned lenses and checked the tin where he kept film. Kurra would sit with a flat stone and scrape antler, the rhythm of his knife making a steady metronome. Thre favored the light. Whatever hour it was, he found a place where paper glowed and sat to draw. Watching Thre draw is a quiet thing that teaches you a secret. Attention makes things live longer. He taught me to look that way. We made caches. Not because we planned to run, but because it is prudent to hide things you love. Vince had been a hunter once in more ways than one. He understood how men thought in parallels of property and prize. He did the digging with the blunt authority of a man who had been ordered into danger and had learned how to read the ground for traps. We buried film tins in root masses, slid negatives into oilcloth, and in one hollowed cedar, we hid a roll of paper with the first set of drawings Thre had given us. Portraits of Kurra and Thre, but also something like a family tree of lines and votes. We left small marks only we could see, a notch cut on a stone, the way a fern bent toward a footpath. There was a calendar we all recognized. It was measured in the coming and going of birds, in the exact day the river took its leave of the shallows and pushed out toward freshets, and in the turn of burrs on the vine. Time in the valley is honest. It tells you what it expects you to know. October 14th, 1977, on Teaching and Trust. Teaching the creatures to take a photograph was slow and full of wonder. A camera is a box that keeps a moment in its belly, and Vince handled that box like a priest. He taught Kurra first because Kurra was deliberate. He showed him how the film went into the camera, how to cock a shutter, and how to listen for the softest click that meant a moment had been caught. Kurra felt the camera as if learning the hum of a tool he might put into his chest for safekeeping. He did not seem to care about the final product as much as the act itself. It was a process of touching the world that left no mark a hunter could find. Thre learned differently. He was impatient for the image to show itself and wanted to see the picture at once, to feel its shape like a new song. We showed him how to hold the glass plate of the developing tray and how to keep his breath from fogging the print. He painted little frames around his photos afterward with charcoal, the way a man frames a painting with a hand he loves. We traded teachings often. I taught them how to set snares for rabbit in places that would not tear the land. Kurra taught me a method of splitting resin that left the tree almost unmarked. Thre taught me to make a pigment from berry and ash that would last years without fading. It felt like a barter of souls. December 23rd, 1977. Winter folds in. Winter. The first year arrived with a bluntness that made our careful plans look like small jokes. Snow came early and wet and pinned the valley like a lid. We insulated holes in the shelters with extra hides and dug the floor down so heat would gather at our feet. We rationed coffee more strictly than meat and found ourselves telling stories before sleep that became less and less about where we had come from and more about where we might stay. Vince had a relapse of old storms. Nights when the wind scraped at the shelter, he would awake with the taste of the jungle in his mouth and the smell of diesel. He had learned how to keep his hands from shaking when he had to, but the valley wore its own pressure into him. I would sit with him and talk in the small hours, and sometimes I would read passages from Grandpa's journals aloud, not for information, but for rhythm. The sentences gave the dark a pattern, and the human voice is as powerful a shelter as any tarp. January 9, 1978. Letters of paper and song. Thre found folded into an old coat a packet of letters from a man I'd never heard of, who had written about a place far to the east where the trees were like columns in a green cathedral. The letters had been traded into this valley and pressed into the archive like a relic. Thre set each envelope out on the firelit floor and traced the shape of each stamp, making a new kind of map from the edges of foreign paper. We spent winter teaching one another to sing. Kurra's hum was like a wind through bone. It made my chest feel as if it held a slow drum. Thre's notes were high and darting and fit the way birds used to fit into my mornings. I would try to make words with them, English syllables and old phrases, until we invented new ones that fit our small community better. Song kept us from snarling at one another and taught us to recognize the human leaning we all had toward small cruelties. March 4, 1978. The man in the metal boots, and in this size. Spring arrived with the sound of metal on the river flats. We were out checking a cache when we saw the tracks, heavy-booted prints that made a stupid, arrogant pattern beside the animal trails. They were not our first indication that the valley's privacy had been breached, but they were the one that made the air taste like rust. A party had moved through at some point during snowmelt. They had left a strip of tarpaulin, something like a metal clamp, and one of the old rope slings we recognized from the way men pack nets. Someone had been here and had not bothered covering their path. Either they were careless or they were trying to leave a map for someone who would come behind. Either way, it was evidence of a method I had hoped we'd never meet. Kurra sat on a log and drummed his fingers along the grain as if he were counting. Thre made a charcoal line on the cave wall and added a face wearing a hat with a brim, a sign we had all learned meant man with intention. We moved the cache the next night. We redoubled our watches. June 1st, 1978, on the loss of a tin. We lost a tin. It is a small thing, and yet when you start hiding a life you discover how substantial small losses can be. The tin we lost had the first 6 negatives of a sequence that showed Kurra holding the old knife, and Thre crouched with a trout between his hands. We had wrapped it in oiled cloth and set it in a hollow behind a root. A heavy rain came and the river rose in a wash that took the soil from the root and left bare dark wood and a hole where our tin had been. It probed at us like a question. Are you the sort of people who can keep a promise? We replaced what we could. Vince rewound another roll of film like a man making sutures on old paper. Thre copied, with charcoal, every line he remembered from the negatives. Kurra found a strip of metal and worked it until it yielded a new tin, hammered and sealed. We learned that secrecy, like a boat, must suffer repairs. August 22nd, 1978. The map decoded. The map in the 1889 guide had been a fold of maps inside maps, and for a while we treated it like a superstition. Then Thre, who had been working on a long strip of paper for months, showed us a series of marks that matched notations in Grandpa's sketches and the margins of the naturalist's guide. It was a set of waypoints. It wasn't coordinates the way men use with machines. It was coordinates of things you would find if you knew how to read the land. A stone that looks like a sleeping animal, the bend of the river that smells of iron, a stand of 3 larches. The mark in the corner was the same cross Grandpa had penciled years ago. We lay the papers out and argued quietly like a council. The map suggested other valleys. It suggested not an army but scattered hosts, a thin net of survivors who had learned the rule of silence. The map did not say whether these places were safe, only that they existed. That was enough. We made a plan that was half hope and half oath. We would not run off in earnest at once. We would spend 5 years learning the valley's edges, building the archive, and making ourselves small enough not to attract attention. Then, if the map's marks held true, we would set out to verify and to build a network. We would make caches with directions disguised as children's drawings. We would leave marks that only the careful would read. We would teach Kurra and Thre how to take a photograph that might be read by the right people later. December 31st, 1978. The year turned on. New Year's Eve, we sat around a small fire and counted the months we've been here like beads on a string. Kurra had carved a set of small tokens, a spruce cone, a bead of bone, a sliver of mica, and given each of us one. We tied them to a cord and wore them the way sailors wear charms, reminders that the world is larger than our fear. Vince wrote in his small book that night. He wrote less and less about what he'd seen in Vietnam, and more about the way a trout holds light. I wrote that I had learned to make my hands listen. Thre sang a new song that had no words, only a shape that made the cold less hard. June 14th, 1979. The second rotor. The helicopter came back with an insistence that made the valley remember pain. This one dipped lower and seemed to scan with intent rather than worry. It circled, passed, and returned like a shark. I can still feel the way its passing smelled of hot metal and of men's impatience. This time they came with something heavier. A crate with a circling symbol engraved into the wood and metal boxes that carried roofs of instruments. The men who emerged had the look of people who measure things by their lab notes. They did not shout. They spoke into small black boxes and moved with a patience that was the opposite of curiosity. They put up temporary poles and took readings of the air that made them look as if they were trying to solve a riddle by pinning it to instruments. They left after a day, but in their wake we found a strip of netting and one of the machine's own bolts snagged in a fur. We had seen their shadow now, not just their voice. The valley tightened itself more. Kurra carved grooves around the doorway that, to us, looked like numbers. When I asked, he tapped his chest, and then the sky, and let his hand fall open. "Remember," he said, and the word was more instruction than a plea. September 3rd, 1979. The night we lost footing. There are nights that rearrange you, and nights that name you again. On a clear night in early September, a ground team came with a dog. I do not know if the dog had been trained to track on scent, or owned the kind of curiosity that men breed into animals to do their dirty work. The dog found one of our false trails and barked, and when one dog barks it is the same as a bell being struck in a crowd. The men followed. We had prepared for such nights, but preparation does not make a thing painless. They came with flashlights and spoke into radios and made the valley into a stage. I watched from high grass and felt a wild shame that we had created a theater in which anyone could be entertained and then hurt. Kurra sat on his haunches and wove bark into a band without looking at the men. Thre pressed a small charcoal piece into his mouth and turned his face away. The men passed within a stone's throw of our shelter and did not see us. They were busy with their instruments and clipboards and the way men often look at things as if the heart is just an object they can chart. Later, when the men were gone, I found a thin strip of aluminum with a manufacturer's stamp and a date, 1975. It was proof that this sort of thing had come here before my arrival. November 18th, 1979. On making networks. We began to make redundant maps. If the primary map was paper, then our second would be music and the third would be a set of marks left in places a person might meet by chance. Thre painted a sequence of birds on the underside of a stone at a crossroads, each bird pointing toward a valley. Kurra carved notches on the face of a cliff that only showed when the sun slanted at the right hour. Vince wrote a short letter and burned it to ash, scattering the ash in a stream that washed out to a bend where a man who once burned letters might pause and look. It was a strange, furtive cartography. We taught Kurra and Thre how to read the maps we had. They learned the notion of triangulation not by numbers, but by story. If you know where the sleeping bear is, and the old burned log, you will find the place when the moon is a certain shape. This made sense in their terms, and it made sense to me because it relied on things that could not be bought. March 12th, 1980. The visitor who left a fingerprint. A man came alone along the upper pass and collapsed by the river. He had no pack and wore old boots and an air of someone who had looked for something and given up on it. We found him semi-conscious and brought him into the shelter. He smelled like towns and the inside of hotels. He told us in halting speech that he had been following rumors and maps and that he'd lost his way. His eyes had a quality I remembered from men who'd been tasked to see something and were surprised to find tenderness instead. We debated whether to help him. Someone with his story could be the kind of person who says the wrong thing at the wrong time, yet he was human and in need. We nursed him. He slept for 3 days. When he woke, he tried to make a list and then abandoned it, instead telling us about a woman he had loved who had gone missing in another valley. He had no interest in our creatures. He had interest in finding relief for his grief. He left a week later, leaving a jar of tobacco and a small tin of coffee as thanks. He had left no track we could follow. I record this to note that not all who come are hunters. Some come in the small, pleading way of people who have lost. Trust is not a binary. It is a slow multiplication. June 4th, 1980, 2 years to the day. 2 years from the day the tracks first pulled us into the valley, the print that started this life felt distant and intimate at once. I walked the first few miles with a camera, but left it on a strap to feel like a man just walking home. The valley felt like a set of rooms in a house I'd been given to keep. I found myself protective in ways that surprised me, of paths and of trees, and of the way a particular stone leaned against the stream. When strangers passed through, they changed the angle of light, and that change was a kind of violence. That summer we found evidence that others had been near the valley before us. A scrap of cloth with an embroidered edge, a small rusted horseshoe, a bone carved into a child's whistle. It made me understand the length of this history, the way people had touched this place over generations. It made me more careful of what I left behind. September 30th, 1980. The year of fewer rotors. It felt as if the machines had retreated for a season. The choppers came less and the ground teams seemed to thin. I do not know if they had found nothing of interest, or if they had been diverted. It did little to ease the constant low pressure that lives under our bodies when secrecy is a vow. We used the lull to sew new seams in our blankets and to experiment with ways of preserving film that did not rely on tins men might think to search. Vince and I began to teach Kurra and Thre how to read photographs. This was not just a lesson in recognition, but in memory, how to see a face and understand that it can be carried without capturing the person. We taught them to take portraits and then to set the negatives away in tins marked only with small natural signs, a feather, a notch, a cluster of lichens, so that a person who chose to look carefully might understand. January 6th, 1981. The birth of the archive. By winter of '81, we had an archive that made me feel like a librarian at a church. There were rolls of film in oiled cloth, stacks of Thre's drawings, bundles of newspaper clippings with notes in margins, and a long list in my own hand that recorded where each tin had been hidden and what it contained. We made copies of things and made copies of copies. Redundancy was our religion. We also made agreements. We agreed that if one of us should choose to leave and tell, he would first bury the archive in a place only the others would know, and would set a chain of notes that could be read only by someone who understood our code. We agreed that none of us would allow the creatures to be taken or caged, even if offered a life of ease in exchange. I write this now both as a record and as an oath. April 20th, 1981. Learning how to leave a trail. That isn't a trail. We devised a system for passing information that was sly enough to frustrate a casual searcher, but generous enough for a careful one. Thre made a series of drawings we called Letters of the Land. A certain notch in a fern would be represented as a curled feather in one of his pieces, a circle of 3 stones as a spiral. Kurra carved particular knots into the inside of a walking staff that he would leave propped in a certain way. I took to writing a line in the margins of Grandpa's map, and then erasing it with lemon juice and ash so that only visible in a certain light would the marks show. These measures were artful because secrecy is often an exercise in craftsmanship. It requires imagination as much as it does grit. We learned to be both careful and beautiful. July 1st, 1981. A close call and a decision sharpened. A contractor's team moved into a neighboring ridge with a machine that beat the earth and with men who used metal detectors. They did not come for Kurra and Thre, but their presence made the valley a perimeter on a map and not just a place of living. They drove a road that stopped a mile short of our pass, dug exploratory holes, and left a smell of gasoline and the earth's disturbed blood. We held a council in the shelter. It was not a council of equals by birth, but it was of mutual respect. We had to decide whether to act beyond keeping and hiding, to go outward, to seek others, or to dig in deeper and make the valley a fortress. The map in the old book weighed heavily on the table between us. Kurra tapped the map and then the horizon. He did not make a speech. He simply made a line with his finger toward the north. Thre nodded and hummed a note that sounded like agreement. Vince and I exchanged looks. We had promised to stay 5 years and to then see if the map's marks could be trusted. We were within 1 year of that point. The presence of machines in the neighboring ridge both hurried and clarified our plan. We would go, and we would go carefully. September 12, 1981. Preparing to leave. We prepared like men packing for exile. We made dry bundles of food, took extra film, and banged a new tin for the most important negatives. We soldered a small metal tube and slid into it a folded line from Grandpa's map with our added notches. We tied the tube into Kurra's belt. We wrote a short, precise note to hide in a place that only another careful person would think to look: the seam of a mail coat inside the tail of an old log. We agreed on signals. 2 dark stones stacked at a crossroads meant pass through. 3 stones meant do not enter. It is silly to make rules and more necessary in a life where the wrong choice can mean being made into an object. We did more than prepare goods. We taught. We taught Kurra how to find and read the smell of different people in the wind, a trick that uses the way scent leaches into lichen. We taught Thre how to fold maps into envelopes smaller shapes so a pocket could hold an atlas. We taught them the danger of a smile from a man who wears his good clothes to a place where people are poor, a warning more honest than many pamphlets. November 5th, 1981, leaving the valley. We left on a gray morning. The river shushed like a secret as we stepped lightly past the cache. Kurra and Thre moved like people who had been packing their lives into pockets for years. Their hands were competent and quiet. I carried the last roll of Grandpa's map in a tin and felt like a man bearing relics. Vince carried the camera and a small bundle of grain. We walked with the knowledge that we had left behind a home and a promise: the archive, the caches, the roots. Walking out of a place you have kept secret is an odd mixture of mercy and grief. You are glad to step beyond the pressure of hiding, and yet you feel like a traitor to the quiet rules you had been taught by living with another species. We walked north, then west, then by a pair of ridges marked by a particular notch that Grandpa had sketched on his first map. January 19th, 1982. A cold month on the road. Winter on the road is not an adventure. It is a ledger of small economies. We bartered what we could: a photograph for a map, a story for a meal, Three's charcoal drawings for a place to sleep. People we met were a mix of those who kept to themselves and those who listened. We kept our mouths buttoned about names and places and used deliberate halves of truth when asked. We found a valley that matched a mark on the map and made careful inquiries. The people there were wary and spoke of a sighting years past that matched the description in the book but had no living memory of settlement. We left a tin in a place we had agreed upon, a dry rock under a slab, marked with a small bird painted by Thre. We found nothing of the sort in 2 other promising places. Still, the fact that marks existed made me feel less alone. March 27th, 1982. The meeting. We found a cluster of signs at last. A set of notches carved into a tree we recognized as the kind Thre favored. A faint circle of 3 stones, and a scratch into the stone that looked like a child's mark. We waited for days, making our presence conspicuous enough to be noticed by a country person, and not by a man with a clipboard. On the 4th dawn, a pair of tall shapes came down a ravine and slid into the clearing like shadows pieced together. They were not Kurra and Thre, but kin, an elder with a band of silver hair threaded into his beard, and a younger being with a scar across his cheek. We did not talk much at first. Language is a brittle thing between groups who've kept silence. We moved slowly into each other's circles, offered coffee, and traded stories that were precise and circumspect. They needed confirmation we were not hunters, and we needed assurance they were not fragile ghosts of people who had been trapped. We showed them photographs and films that Vince had with him. They watched the moving surface with careful faces, and in the end, invited us to leave something and to take something away. They had an archive too, smaller and more carefully hidden. The elder had a book with a dried leaf pressed into its pages and a list of names in a script that bent like a vine. We exchanged small items, a spool of thread for a carved whistle, a strip of mirror for a scrap of map. It was a meeting of people who had kept the same vow in different places. May 6th, 1982. The plan hardened. After the meeting we built a loose council of willing men and creatures, who could be trusted not to turn the world into a museum. The council made small rules: never to speak in public about the specifics of a living place, to move artifacts only when certain it would not attract attention, to keep care for the young and old among them. We devised a means of passing messages that did not require new inventions, but instead used what had been hidden: cached tins, a pattern of bird paintings, and certain page marks in old books that could be rubbed to reveal hidden ink. We decided we would return to the valley for seasons, that we would teach and learn and exchange archives discreetly, and that we would try to preserve what remained, not by fencing it, but by letting it keep its natural speed. We agreed on a single elderly phrase as the test of membership: we keep the weather for each other. If the phrase came back, you were among the people who understood the cost. June 1st, 1982, Counts and Preparations. We had less than a year to the 5-year mark since we first followed the prints. We made plans to split our time: winters on the road to meet other nodes, and summers in the valley to replenish the archive and restore the shelter. We marked places on a map hidden inside a book whose title was so unremarkable as to be forgettable. We hid codes in the fold of the binding. We hid the map in the place where the daylight warmed the spine in a particular way, so that anyone who might be curious could warm the book and find the prints. There is an awkwardness to writing plans that are meant to survive you. You conjure every manner of failure, and then you sit down and number contingencies like a man who must guess his own death. I made a list of caches, and who would have the key. I wrote a short note to Vince about what to do if I did not return: to take the negatives to a particular valley, and to bury them where the ground smells of iron. When I read that note to myself, it felt like a line from an old play. Yet again, we did what men do. We tried to look forward, and to give ourselves a soft place to land. June 20th, 1982, a return for a short while. We returned to the valley for a brief summer. The river had its old patterns, and the shelters looked like rooms we'd stood in 100 times. Thre had painted a series of new birds on the cave wall. Kurra had added to the carved notches. The archive had been kept. The tins were where they should be. There was comfort in that. Vince and I spent evenings with the creatures, and sometimes in the dark, I lay awake and thought about the thinness of the line we walked. We had become custodians and also liars for the sake of shelter. It made my tongue taste like old iron. June 30th, 1982, the last day I wrote by daylight. I am sitting by the river, and the light is the kind that makes ink look more important than it might be. There is a plane in the blue somewhere beyond the ridges, and it sounds like a toy until the sound grows and becomes a memory. I have wrapped the most important negatives in 2 oiled cloths and placed them in a tin that is now sealed and hammered by Kurra's own hand. I have carved a simple mark inside the tin. A notch like the one on Grandpa's map, doubled to mean guarded. I have written the names of the valleys we have reason to trust, and burned the paper and scattered the ash at a bend where the water once stopped to lick a stone. I have about 20 pages left in this book. We have decided that I will return to the north and then to the east for a season, and that Vince will remain here for a while to tend the shelter and to keep the archive. We will continue our pattern of rotation. It is a compromise of practicalities and affections. I want to go because there is a duty to confirm the map's marks, and because the world outside sometimes feeds itself by devouring what it does not understand. I want to go also because I have a certain sort of restiveness that will not be quieted by one valley alone. Kurra has given me a small token, a strip of bark with a single feather tied to it. He pressed it into my palm and made a sound that could have been a blessing. Thre drew a small map of where the sun would be at the first day of winter and pinned it into my jacket. He drew a face that looked like my own in charcoal and then erased the eyes so the likeness would be private. If all goes well, we will have a pattern. Me moving outward to connect the nodes, Vince and the creatures tending the heart. If all does not go well, then this book will be an orphan of testimony. There is an odd comfort in both possibilities. The mission is not built on heroism. It is built on stubbornness and on the insistence that someone answer the question, who will care for the quiet things? July 12th, 1982, a quiet resolve. I have packed my things. I wrapped this journal in oilcloth and have made a copy of the key pages, hiding one among the books in Grandpa's old glove box and another in the hearthstone under Kurra's carved notch. I have placed my trust in small redundancies. I have tried to teach Kurra and Thre a simple phrase to use if they are ever addressed by a man with a pen. We keep the weather, and to then offer no more than that. I write now because the habit of writing is a tether that keeps me honest. There is danger in the world, and there is a way men are tempted to make a profit out of wonder. I do not want that to happen. I do not wish to be the man who showed the world a specimen. I would rather be the man who made a doorway for other keepers to speak in silence. If these pages find their way into hands that would use them to do harm, then consider this an imploring. The creatures here are people by another name. They are kin to a way of living the land that we have been given to protect. Do not sell them. Do not cage them. If this is read by someone who would do right, then follow the marks and follow with the patience and the humility that will be required. July 14th, 1982. The last thing I tucked. I will leave this book in the cedar trunk under the false floor, with the leather strap tied through a notch that only someone who knows the old carvings would find. I have made a small map inside the back cover. Not one that gives coordinates to the foolish, but one that suggests how to find a few of the caches if the reader is patient and careful. I have asked Vince to take photographs on his next rotation and to fold them in a way that the edges show only to the eye that looks for the feather mark. If I die on the road, let these pages be what people know. If I return, let this be proof that we tried. Either way, it is an act of witness. I have no illusions that the world will be grateful for the work of careful keeping. Men are not all grateful, but someone must keep the weather. E.R. Archival note: the pages that follow are sparse. Elmer's handwriting becomes more hurried in the last entries, and then stops. The leather book was found in the cedar trunk after his death in late 1982, exactly where he said it would be. We recovered the negatives hidden in oiled cloth and the tins where they had been placed. Vince returned months after Elmer's last noted departure and found their shelter intact, but with signs of haste. A knocked pot, a scarf left where a hand had pulled it off in a hurry. He remained in the valley for another season, and then slowly drifted back to the edge of settled country. I will not reconstruct the circumstances of Elmer Reid's death here, beyond what is known in public record. He did not die in the valley. He was found near a small cabin by a traveler and was reported to the authorities. The cause is listed as exposure and complications consistent with an extended period on the road. There is no official mention of the travel he had been making on behalf of the network he describes. The materials in this volume, the photographs, the drawings, the clippings, and the maps, have been preserved exactly as they were found, with minimal intervention to keep them legible. We have standardized creature names in the notes to avoid confusion. Kurra, originally spelled variously Kurra, Kar, and Thre, originally Thre. The negatives have been copied and stored in a secure archive. The originals remain protected. This journal is presented as the found testimony Elmer Reid left behind. It reads as both field notes and a personal testament. It is for readers to consider what to do with such knowledge. The ethical impulse in Elmer's pages is not to claim fame, but to ask a question that any careful person should ask. How do we witness without destroying? If this story moved you, subscribe to follow carefully told accounts of unusual histories, and consider this a call to conversation rather than a call to action. If you find yourself wanting to seek out the subject of this journal in person, do not. Seek instead to learn ways of keeping what you discover safe and private. The work Elmer begins in these pages is a practice of restraint, as much as of discovery. Transcript variants have been noted and standardized in the editorial notes. Kurra Kar standardized to Kurra, Thre standardized to Thre.